At exactly 2:32 p.m., Carol Hunt opened her front door and saw a familiar face, carrying what seemed to be her daughter's belongings. She was completely unaware that 13 days of meticulous planning had culminated in this very moment, and that the young man on her doorstep was about to unleash the most calculated act of vengeance her family would ever endure. For 25-year-old Louise Hunt, the tranquil town of Bushey in Hertfordshire was where she called home. Louise lived with her family in a single-family home on Ashland Close. During the COVID lockdown, she had launched a successful dog grooming business called Groom and Glow. Working out of a converted studio in her family's backyard, her clients adored her gentle touch and the genuine care she showed their beloved pets. Louise was the youngest daughter of John Hunt, a BBC racing commentator, and his wife, Carol. At 61 years old, Carol was described by friends as the nicest, kindest, and sweetest person they had ever known. She was an active member of St. James's Church, located on Bushey High Street. She and John had met years earlier at a nightclub in Hemel Hempstead, and their love story blossomed into a marriage that brought them 3 daughters. Hannah Hunt, 28, was an esthetician at an anti-aging clinic in Radlett. Her colleagues remembered her as a fantastic therapist, adored by her clients. She always greeted everyone with a smile and was in a long-term relationship with Alex Klein, who would later describe her as an angel and the perfect woman. The sisters had both attended Loretto College in St. Albans and stayed exceptionally close all through their adult years. The Hunt family seemed to have it all. John's successful career as the main racing commentator for BBC Radio 5 Live had made him a recognized voice across the nation, but at home, he was simply a devoted husband and father. They were, by all accounts, living a picture-perfect life. But on July 9th, 2024, that picture-perfect life would be shattered forever by a man consumed with rage, a sense of entitlement, and a complete inability to handle rejection. Louise met Kyle Clifford sometime in late 2022. She was 24, and he was 25. Born on April 5, 1998, Kyle was a former soldier who had a short stint in the Queen's Dragoon Guards before his discharge from the military in 2022. He worked as a security guard for Amthol, a fire and security services firm. However, his co-workers would later describe his behavior toward women as immature and inappropriate. Kyle's background was a troubled one. His older brother, Bradley Clifford, was already serving a life sentence for murder, having been convicted of intentionally running down teenage moped riders with his Ford Mustang back in 2017. Kyle reportedly referred to his brother as a geezer and visited him in prison every 2 weeks. There was a history of violence in the family that seemed to run in their blood. To the outside world, their 18-month relationship appeared completely normal. Kyle was a regular visitor at the Hunt family home, often joining them for meals and family events. John Hunt would later state that he never once heard a raised voice during any of Kyle's visits. On the surface, there were no red flags, no indication that anything was wrong. But behind closed doors, a very different story was unfolding. Louise's friends started to notice changes in her. Kyle was controlling, in ways that were both subtle and obvious. He forbade Louise from wearing makeup, something she had always loved to do. He began dictating her social life and grew intensely jealous of her friendships with other men. He had what Louise's friends would call a nasty temper, and his bouts of road rage often left Louise feeling uncomfortable and humiliated. One incident was particularly disturbing. Kyle showed Louise and her friends a video from Andrew Tate that depicted an animal being harmed. When they reacted with disgust, Kyle just laughed, saying he thought it was funny. It was one of many red flags that made Louise's friends hope that she would eventually break up with him. But Kyle was also leading a secret life, one that Louise knew absolutely nothing about. He was active on the dating apps, Hinge and Bumble, pursuing relationships with other women, all while pretending to be Louise's devoted boyfriend. At his job, supervisors grew increasingly concerned about the way Kyle talked about women. He was known for making degrading comments and displaying what they clearly recognized as misogynistic attitudes. But underneath the surface, Louise was beginning to see flashes of a much darker reality. Just 5 days before she was killed, she created a note on her phone, titling it, "When You're Sad, Look." In that note, she chronicled Kyle's deep-seated racial prejudices, his hateful comments about transgender people, the demeaning way he spoke to her, and his explosive temper. Those closest to her had no inkling of how dire the situation had truly become. By June of 2024, Louise was at the end of her rope. A young woman once known for her vibrancy and confidence was now growing deeply distressed by Kyle's behavior. She opened up to her friends about his arrogance, his rage, and his need to control every aspect of her life, as well as his volatile outbursts whenever things didn't go his way. On July 3rd, a mere 6 days before her death, Louise posted a message on social media that was profoundly telling. In hindsight, it would be viewed as both a cry for help and a powerful declaration of her own strength. She shared a post that read, "I admire women who leave. It doesn't matter one bit if you left after the first time or the 12th time. I admire that courage. I couldn't care less if people called you stupid for 11 years, but in the 12th year you decided you were finished. It takes immense strength to cut that tie. It takes a profound amount of self-love to finally choose yourself." This post was an unmistakable sign that Louise was steeling herself to leave Kyle, acknowledging the immense courage it would require to escape what had devolved into a toxic and damaging relationship. On June 26, 2024, Louise finally summoned the strength to end things with him. Her father, John, would later recall it as a textbook, mature separation, handled with as much care as the situation allowed. Louise wrestled with the pain of letting go of someone she once loved, yet she also knew with chilling certainty that Kyle was not, and would never be, the partner she needed. On the surface, Kyle seemed to accept the breakup. There was no high drama, no public spectacle. There were no threats, no overt signs that he was plotting something monstrous. To Louise and her family, it appeared Kyle had handled the news with an unexpected level of maturity. Louise was led to believe he understood and respected her decision. She was tragically, devastatingly wrong. What Louise couldn't possibly know was that Kyle's calm demeanor was a meticulously crafted lie. Beneath it, he was seething with an incandescent rage. He utterly refused to accept Louise's choice, and he began plotting what he considered the ultimate revenge. In his mind, if Louise thought she could simply discard him and move on, he was about to prove just how mistaken she was. Mere hours after they broke up, Kyle was already online, researching ways to make Louise pay for what he perceived as her betrayal. He had no intention of letting her go, and he would ensure that no one in her family would be left to support her through what he viewed as her grave mistake. Within just 24 hours of their separation, he was already orchestrating the most horrific act of vengeance conceivable. For 13 days, from June 26th to July 9th, Kyle systematically prepared to commit mass murder. On June 28th, only 2 days after Louise had ended their relationship, Kyle started ordering weapons over the internet. He bought a Horizon Cornet MXT 405 compound crossbow with 6 bolts and a 10-inch steel butcher's knife, and tried to purchase a Co-2 Glock air pistol, although it failed to arrive in time. He also acquired large amounts of duct tape, rope, and gasoline. Kyle's internet history during this time would later reveal the chilling extent of his preparations. He performed extensive research into John Hunt's professional schedule, meticulously studying horse racing events to pinpoint when the BBC commentator would be out of the house. He combed through Carol Hunt's Facebook profile, gathering intelligence on the family's daily routines and habits. He went so far as to check the weather forecast for July 9th, making sure the conditions would be ideal for his attack. On the 4th of July, security cameras captured Kyle at a B&Q hardware store, buying duct tape. He appeared methodical, completely at ease, like any other man shopping for supplies, with the casual air of someone picking up materials for a simple home improvement project. No one could have possibly guessed the true, monstrous purpose behind his purchases. On the night before the murders, Kyle's online activity took an even more sinister turn. He viewed as many as 10 videos by the controversial influencer Andrew Tate, absorbing content that prosecutors would later characterize as being steeped in a violent hatred toward women. Tate, who is facing charges related to sexual assault and human exploitation, advocates for a worldview where women are treated as property, a belief that fueled Kyle's fury over Louise's rejection. For Kyle, these videos provided a blueprint for what he considered his righteous revenge. During this time, Kyle also penned letters to his family documents, saturated with self-pity that laid bare his twisted state of mind. In them, he claimed he couldn't live without Louise and absolved his loved ones, saying, "None of you have failed," but insisted he needed to find peace. On the morning of July 9th, Kyle put on his mask of normalcy one last time, visiting a garden center with his mother, father, and young niece, where surveillance footage captured a man who seemed completely unremarkable. He even took a call from another woman he was seeing, a stark reminder that despite his claims of being devastated by the breakup, Louise had never been his sole romantic focus. While his family was enjoying their morning together, Kyle's arsenal of weapons and restraints laid in wait inside his car: the crossbow, the knife, the duct tape, and the rope. Everything he required to annihilate the Hunt family was in place. All that was left was to execute his plan. At 1:40 p.m. on July 9th, 2024, Kyle Clifford parked his car near Ashland Close in Bushey. He remained in his vehicle, watching the Hunt family residence, conducting his final surveillance. He stepped out of the car for a moment to see which vehicles were in the driveway, confirming for himself exactly who was present and who was not. Back in his car, Kyle looked up horse racing schedules online, verifying that John Hunt would be away at his job. Every piece was falling perfectly into place. Carol would be at home by herself, Louise would be at her dog grooming studio in the backyard, and Hannah would be returning later from her shift at the beauty salon. At 2:32 p.m., Kyle walked up to the front door of the Hunt family's house. He had his knife hidden in a backpack and was ready for the performance of a lifetime. When Carol opened the door, Kyle's act was friendly and completely casual. He claimed he was just there to drop off some of Louise's belongings, and then asked her how she was. Carol, ever the kind and compassionate soul, expressed genuine concern for Kyle's own well-being. She encouraged him to seek counseling and offered him emotional support for what she believed was simply the pain of a recent breakup. Even as Kyle stood on her porch with a murderous plot in his mind, Carol Hunt showed him the same kindness that had defined her entire life. The exchange was all recorded by the Hunt family's doorbell camera, preserving the final, ordinary moments of Carol's life. She couldn't have known that welcoming Kyle inside would be the last choice she ever made. At 2:33 p.m., Kyle stabbed Carol Hunt to death in the hallway of her own home, as Carol fought desperately to survive. But she had been ambushed by someone to whom she had only ever shown compassion. Following the attack, Kyle waited for about 35 minutes. He stayed inside the house with Carol's body, making certain she was gone, before moving on to the next stage of his terrifying plan. All the while, Louise's dog grooming clients came and went through the side gate, completely oblivious to the horror that had taken place just feet away. At 3:07 p.m., Kyle exited the home and walked back to his car to get the crossbow. He concealed the weapon beneath a blanket, re-entered the house by stepping over Carol's body, and positioned himself to lie in wait for Louise. Louise wrapped up her workday and came into the house at 4:11 p.m. The doorbell camera instantly picked up high-pitched screams that continued for 15 minutes. Louise had just found her mother's body and understood that she was now trapped inside with the man who had killed her. What transpired next was a multi-hour ordeal of unimaginable torment. Kyle bound Louise and made it impossible for her to call for help. During this period, he subjected her to a series of degrading and violent acts, later characterized by prosecutors as a cruel and spiteful assault. At 5:31 p.m., Kyle took Louise's cell phone and sent a text to John Hunt, asking, "What time are you home?" He was confirming how much time he had left to carry out his scheme before Louise's father got back. He also searched online for information on disabling smoke detectors, as authorities believe he intended to burn the house down, with the bodies still inside. At 6:20 p.m., Kyle, after spending some time in the backyard, came back into the house and closed the patio blinds. He was setting the stage for the final act of his deadly plan. Just as Hannah Hunt was arriving at the property, she tried calling her mother's phone. At 6:49 p.m., the call went unanswered. She walked into the house mere seconds after Kyle had fired a crossbow bolt, striking Louise in the back. The wound was instantly fatal. Hannah called for her mother as she made her way through the home, only to come face to face with Kyle when she reached the top of the stairs. A confrontation erupted immediately. At 6:52 p.m., amidst the chaos, Hannah was able to send a frantic text message to her boyfriend, Alex Klein. "Call police immediately to my house now. Kyle's here. Police now. He's tying us up." She quickly silenced her phone, a desperate attempt to hide the fact that she had just called for help. Just 2 minutes later, Kyle turned the crossbow on Hannah, shooting her in the chest. He then fled the residence, the weapon hidden beneath a blanket, leaving behind a scene of absolute horror. Even with a fatal wound, Hannah Hunt showed incredible bravery in her last moments alive. At 6:57 p.m., while fighting through her own mortal injuries, she found the bodies of her mother and her sister. She managed to call 999, telling the dispatcher she had been shot and was afraid she was dying. She explained that her mother and sister were also victims of the attack. She provided the address just before the line went dead. Armed officers and paramedics were immediately dispatched to the scene. When first responders arrived, they found Hannah still alive in the main doorway, the crossbow bolt protruding from her chest. But despite their rapid response, all 3 women were pronounced dead at the scene. Hannah's final, heroic act had ultimately saved her father's life. If she hadn't been able to call for help, her father, John Hunt, would have walked right into Kyle's ambush upon returning from work later that evening. At 6:54 p.m., Kyle Clifford fled the Hunt family home and started driving toward his own residence in Enfield. This was the man who had just committed one of the most monstrous crimes in recent British history, and yet he appeared chillingly calm. Security footage captured him leaving the scene, his crossbow concealed by a blanket. Kyle pulled over at a rest area in Fernhill before parking on Cook's Hole Road. At 7:32 p.m., he walked into Lavender Hill Cemetery, which was near his house. There, hidden in the dense brush, he tried to fashion a makeshift noose from a rope and a tree branch. But they were both too flimsy to hold his weight, making any attempt to hang himself impossible. Meanwhile, authorities had launched one of the largest manhunts in the UK's recent history. The Hertfordshire Constabulary spearheaded the operation, with support from the Metropolitan Police. Armed officers, specialised search teams, and helicopters began combing the area. The sheer scale of the operation underscored the severity of the crimes and the urgent need to find a man who was still armed and considered extremely dangerous. At 8:30 a.m. on July 10th, police released Kyle's name, age, and photograph to the public. Chief Superintendent John Simpson issued a public warning that Kyle might still be armed and urged anyone with a sighting to call 999 immediately, and not to approach him. He also made a direct appeal. "Kyle, if you are seeing this, please make contact." Police confirmed the incident was a targeted attack and that the suspect was known to the victims. However, they were careful to withhold the full nature of Kyle's relationship with Louise. But for 22 hours, Kyle remained on the run. He hid in the cemetery's undergrowth, a coward who had shown no mercy to 3 innocent women, now cowering in the darkness instead of facing the consequences for his horrific actions. At 6 p.m. the following day, armed police finally zeroed in on Kyle's location in Lavender Hill Cemetery. As officers and a canine unit closed in, Kyle committed one final, cowardly act. He turned the crossbow on himself, firing a bolt into his own chest, the very same weapon he used to murder Louise and Hannah Hunt. The self-inflicted wound was catastrophic, leaving Kyle paralyzed from the chest down. He would never walk again. Police confirmed that officers had not fired a single shot. During his capture, Kyle was treated at the scene before his transfer to the Royal London Hospital. He was placed under a 24-hour guard. On July 11th, Kyle was formally arrested on suspicion of 3 counts of murder, but his cowardice was a long way from being over. The physical evidence at the scene painted a clear picture of the prolonged attack. DNA evidence proved Kyle had raped Louise during the hours-long ordeal. Duct tape residue on Louise's wrists and ankles confirmed she had been restrained, exactly as prosecutors claimed. The investigative team reviewed over 5,000 hours of surveillance footage and conducted hundreds of interviews. But the evidence was so damning that Kyle's guilt was never seriously in question. The only thing left to determine was whether he would face justice for all of his crimes. On September 17, 2024, Kyle appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court through a video feed from his hospital bed. The prosecution charged him with 3 counts of murder, false imprisonment, and possession of a deadly weapon. On December 19th, Kyle stunned the courtroom by pleading not guilty to all charges. At Cambridge Crown Court, a 4th charge was added to the indictment, the rape of Louise Hunt. But on January 22, 2025, Kyle reversed his position, admitting to the murders, while still claiming innocence on the rape charge. Kyle's rape trial started on March 3, 2025. In a final display of cowardice, he refused to show up for his own trial. On March 6th, after only 45 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Kyle Clifford was convicted of raping Louise Hunt. 5 days later, Kyle again refused to face the court for his sentencing. Justice Joel Benathan addressed him in absentia. "The evidence I have heard shows you to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt." John Hunt delivered a powerful victim impact statement to the empty defendant's chair, calling Kyle a psychopath and informing him that the screams of hell awaited him. Amy Hunt called Kyle a monster. Justice Benathan sentenced Kyle to 3 life terms without parole. At 26 years old, Kyle would die in prison. The name Kyle Clifford will be remembered only for his cowardice, but the legacy of Carol, Louise, and Hannah Hunt lives on through the love they shared and the strength they demonstrated. As John Hunt said, "I hope women around the world will take Louise's bravery as a shining beacon for their lives." That beacon continues to shine long after Kyle Clifford's darkness has been locked away forever.